Now, I know the thought would never cross your mind, but I want to give you a warning. Not permission, but a warning. The next few weeks, the calendar of church readings for Sundays in the Gospels don't look to the present moment in Jesus' life, but have Jesus talking about what's to come, the future, the end times, we might say. And I know the thought would never cross your mind about skipping church. In fact, that would be the farthest thing from your mind on a day like today. There's nothing else you'd rather do on a Sunday morning than be here. But I'm going to warn you, the next few weeks could be dicey. It could get a little uncomfortable, beginning today with Jesus' conversation with the Sadducees. Now, today in Luke's gospel, we find ourselves in chapter 20. Last week, we were with Zacchaeus in Jericho, and that was outside of Jerusalem, but Jesus was making his way to the capital city of Judea, where as you know, if you're familiar with the story of Jesus, things are about to reach a fever pitch in tension. Now in chapter 20, Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem. And the first thing he does when he arrives in the capital city is he goes straight to the temple, which is the center of Jewish life 2,000 years ago. And what does he do? He causes a ruckus. He starts driving out people who are seeking to use the temple for their own self-centered means. And in response to that, we're told in chapter 19, verse 47, that the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill Jesus. You see, Jesus shows up in Jerusalem and brings a shutdown to all the economic, political, and religious activities of the people in Jerusalem. He causes a scene. He's drawing attention to himself. He's setting up a showdown between him and the powers that be. And the powers that be don't like it very much. And so after verse 47 in chapter 19, when the leaders of the people have committed themselves to finding a way to kill Jesus, there comes a series of questions in Luke's gospel. Leaders of the people begin to test Jesus. They begin to ask him loaded questions to try and catch him out, to incriminate him, to expose him as a fraud, expose him as a traitor, expose him as a rebel to the Roman Empire. First is the question about where Jesus' authority comes from. Where do you get off, Jesus, talking like that? Who told you you could behave this way? Then the second question comes about the relationship between temple and state. Do you pay taxes, Jesus? Do you owe the Roman Empire something, or do you feel like we don't need to pay them homage? And now the third question we have comes from this group of people called the Sadducees. And if you're not familiar with the phrase Sadducees, these are an aristocratic class of Jews in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. They are the upper wealthy elite, the people who were in charge of keeping the daily temple operations going. And not only that, they work with Rome to make sure that the peace is kept in Jerusalem. You see, the Romans are many miles away in terms of leadership and governance, so they have to use people who are local to keep the population under control. So Rome and the Sadducees had a deal, an agreement, where the Sadducees would make sure things ran smoothly on behalf of Rome, and in exchange, Rome would take care of the Sadducees, give them preference and privilege and power among the people, back them in their claims to being in charge. Now, the Sadducees are interesting. We actually have people who wrote about them besides the Gospels, who talk about how the Sadducees didn't affirm any authority of books in what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, except for the first 5. If you were to take a Bible and you looked at the first 5 books, what Jews would call the Torah, that's what the Sadducees claimed was authoritative. That's what they listened to when it came to learning about who God was and who they're called to be. But all the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures, the prophets, the Psalms, the writings, none of that were accepted by the Sadducees as authoritative. Now, why is that? Well, the first 5 books, the Torah, kind of gives the foundational story of who God's people are, but also in the first 5 books, it has a lot of rules, a lot of regulations about things like sacrifices. Now, can you see why the Sadducees would be interested in things like sacrifices? Because they were in charge of maintaining the temple where the sacrifices occurred. But beyond that, when you start hearing from the prophets, which we'll hear from during the season of Advent, or you start reading the Psalms, or you read the writings like Job or Ecclesiastes, pretty soon you get a voice of opposition, a voice that is kind of a harmony to the melody that is the Torah. I've heard one person call the prophets, for example, the conscience of the Torah. They interpret how we read these first 5 books. And if you read the prophets, you'll notice that there's a lot of condemnation, a lot of criticism about people who are in charge of things, that they're seeking to be in charge for self-gain and not for the benefit of the whole community. Now, can you see why the Sadducees wouldn't accept those books as authoritative? In the prophets, in the writings, you start getting ideas about what's going to happen when all of this comes to a head. What's going to happen when God finally shows up and says, enough, I'm putting things right again. And you get ideas like what's going to happen to our state. God will judge us, measure our worth, find whether we're at fault or not. And then you get ideas about resurrection, God raising people up from the grave, restoring them to a permanent place within God's own life. The Sadducees rejected all of that and said, none of that has any binding on us. Because it challenges the way they operate. It challenges the way they run day to day. It challenges the way they see their behavior, right? No longer can they say, this is what we ought to do, because there's this contrary voice telling them that they should not hold power for themselves, that they should not seek to gain personally from controlling the temple. The Sadducees have a bone to pick with Jesus. He's shown up in the temple and he's caused a scene, and they didn't like that very much. So they come to him with this mock question, except the Sadducees are not looking to dialogue. They're looking to tear Jesus down, to expose him as an unserious and unskilled teacher of the faith. And so they give him this ridiculous scenario. Did you hear it? Where they don't believe in things like resurrection, but they pose this hypothetical situation to him to see what he's going to do, how he will respond. Teacher, they say with a voice that's full of satire, this is our law from Moses. You believe in Moses, right? You think he's in charge. Well, Moses told us to do this. He told us that if a man's brother dies, a man should marry the widow. He should marry the widow so that this man's brother's line might continue, that his name might live on, that he might have children, so that he won't be forgotten, that indeed his life will not be extinguished, that people will remember him. Moses told us to do this, but now you've got this silly idea called resurrection, Jesus. Tell us, how do you square it? Who are you listening to? Are you listening to Moses? Or are you listening to these crazy people who talk about things like eternity and resurrection of the dead? Now, what I find fascinating is that, and this will come no surprise to you, Jesus is a much better person than me. He recognizes what the Sadducees are trying to do, but he still engages them in dialogue, does he not? Now, if I were in Jesus' shoes, I wouldn't have taken the bait. I would have taken an opportunity to condemn them, to call them out and tell them how they're trying to set me up and make me look dumb. But Jesus seizes this opportunity to maintain a line of communication, but in his response, he exposes something rotten in the way that the Sadducees approach both the written word of the Torah and their thinking about life in general. Jesus says that in this age we are married and given in marriage, but in the age to come, in the resurrected life, there will be no need for marriage. And he points out that the whole purpose of Moses' rule is both to take care of the woman. In those days, 2,000 years ago, women were an especially vulnerable group in ancient society. If they were left widowed, they would not have means to provide for themselves if they didn't have family. So one, marriage is kind of a safety net for women in the ancient world to make sure that they're fed and taken care of and have a people who surround them with love and support. But also, Jesus points out that marriage is the way that we continue to have kids, to live on, to have a name that continues beyond our own life. But in the resurrected age, there's no concern about keeping your name alive. There's no concern about making sure vulnerable people are taken care of, because in the age to come, Jesus points out, we all finally live up to that name, child of God. There's nothing else that's keeping us from being in the fullness of God's loving presence. That nothing can keep us separated from the love of God. And in the resurrected life, that will finally become real and eternal for every one of us. So Jesus points out that the way they're reading the law is broken. They're thinking that what we do today continues on for eternity. But Jesus says what will happen in eternity is totally different from what's happening right now. It will look completely different. The things we have to rely on right now will not be necessary when all is said and done. When God finally gets what God wants, which is a life without sin, without death, without anything keeping us between God and each other. So what Jesus does is he points out that while the Sadducees are focused on the reading of Moses' words and obeying them, Jesus is applying an understanding of Moses' teaching, looking beyond the words on the page to say, this is what Moses intends. This is what he's pointing to when he talks about concepts of marriage and how to take care of each other. It's not about following the rule to the T. It's about living into the essence of what's behind the law. Why am I talking about all this? Because I believe that more often than not, people who follow Jesus 2,000 years later look a whole lot more like the Sadducees than Jesus. We look a whole lot more like the Sadducees than Jesus when it comes to organizing, when it comes to practicing, when it comes to believing the faith that we've been gifted by God. That we want to look to what the words are on the page and make sure we keep those no matter what, rather than paying attention to the idea, to the essence behind the words, and following that wherever it leads. Instead, we start keeping score, managing and maintaining, making sure things run smoothly, rather than keeping up with the God who is already out ahead of us, doing something new, doing something else. The former leader of the Worldwide Anglican Communion, Rowan Williams, warns us that there is a risk for any religion that looks to accomplished events as its foundation, because what was once strange is now familiar and thus becomes an idol. For the Sadducees, the temple and its daily maintenance become the reason for their existence, not for the God toward which the temple points. The temple is a sign of God's presence among us, but the Sadducees mistake the sign for the real thing. They're zealous about the temple and maintaining it for their own benefit, missing the God who is right in front of them, right here, right now. Have you ever known a church or a Christian to be like that? To take the sign as the real thing rather than the thing itself? Maybe the way we do worship. Maybe the way we function in outreach and mission. Maybe the way we care about our buildings or our name or our website, whatever it is, we might mistake the sign for the real thing. We might get focused on maintaining and managing rather than discerning where God is actually leading us and going. It's a danger for people who look to events that have already been accomplished as their foundation. Now, fortunately, Christianity is not just a faith that looks to the past, but it looks in hope to the future, to what is to come, but has not already happened. We're not stuck doomed to the past, looking for a God who's distant and far away in time, trying to uncover, like archaeologists, what God has been up to. Instead, we're looking all around us, awaiting, beholding the coming of God. I know that we get uncomfortable when Jesus starts talking like this about things that are to come in the future. And it's because churches have abused these passages. They've used them to keep people in line, to control them out of fear and anxiety. And I want to own that as a leader of the church, that there is a great temptation for people in the church to use passages about the future in order to make sure that you behave today. And I don't think that's the intention of what Jesus is trying to do. But I also want to acknowledge that we're probably uneasy about passages of what's to come because it's out of our control. Like the Sadducees, we'd rather look to what has happened or what's happening right now because that's much more comfortable. That's what we're used to. That's what we can get our hands around and maintain with an iron grip. But Jesus points us ahead to an age that has not yet happened, inviting us to dream of what is to come rather than settle for what already has been. This is a God who does not invite us into a life of comfort, but this is a God who invites us into a liberated life instead. You noticed in his response to the Sadducees, Jesus quotes the Exodus story, and we read that earlier in our worship service when Moses comes across the burning bush. And Moses notices that it's an odd sight, a bush that's on fire but is not falling apart and burning to a crisp. And so he draws near, and what he comes across is nothing less than the presence of the living God who made all things. Can you imagine encountering that density of a holy presence? That untamable, uncontrollable presence of life that's dynamic, that knows you by name and has sought you out. It's humbling. It's scary. When we come face to face with that presence, we're reminded how limited, how feeble we actually are as creatures. And yet this presence at the burning bush doesn't want to destroy Moses. It wants to liberate him. It wants to invite him into a future that has not yet been possible for him. A man who's been on the run, wanted for murder, now stuck in the desert, tending smelly sheep. This God invites Moses into a future he could not have envisioned before. This is a God who is liberating, who seeks our freedom, not our comfort. And this is the terrifying truth for us, that we're creatures who are in relationship with a living God. And to be in relationship with a living God means that God cannot be pinned down by us. God's not some celestial vending machine where I insert the right sacrifices and I get the right outcomes every single time. No, this God cannot be controlled. This God cannot be told what to do. And that's a terrifying thought for me because when I come face to face with this living, dynamic presence, I realize that a lot of the time I'm spending my time and worship and energy on things that are just a louder and larger version of myself. That I'm worshiping a God who's really just the summation of my preferences, my values, my morals. But time and time again, I'm invited to experience the living God instead. And it's hard because then we have to reconcile ourselves with the fact that, like the Sadducees, much of what we've been doing has just been managing and maintaining a dead idol rather than encountering the living God. But here's the good news. Here's the good news. We worship a living God. And as Robert Jensen, the theologian from the 20th century, put it, the difference between a dead God and a living God is that the living God can still surprise us. Amen? A living God can still surprise you. For the Sadducees, they come face to face with this living God who hasn't been stuck in the temple, but has been running around all of Judea, doing things, teaching things, finally just now showing up in the temple's precincts. And just now, the Sadducees are encountering him face to face. The living God can still surprise us. Jesus references the story of Moses, that Exodus story, where a group of slaves are freed from the world's greatest superpower at the time, led through the desert in an improbable way, and invited into a unique covenant relationship with God to be blessings in the universe. this God can still surprise us. We know that after this conversation with the Sadducees, Jesus will ultimately be arrested. He'll be tried in a kangaroo court. He'll be tortured. He'll be executed by the state. And we know that's not the end of his story. A living God can still surprise us. I look out on this congregation, and I don't just see people who are showing up dutifully on Sundays. I see stories. I see groups and faces and identities who remind each other of good news. When one of us is hurting, another of us picks the other up. We come together because we know we can't do it alone. That if we tried to do this by ourselves, we'd be hopeless, stuck in the dark, but we gather together, encouraging, strengthening, and carrying each other on the road of faith. Because we believe a living God can still surprise us. We support organizations like The Good Hood, Magdalena House, many different nonprofits who take people who seem to be at a dead end, at the worst point in their lives where nothing will get better. And because of the presence of these leaders, things do change. Because they believe at their core a living God can still surprise us. Friends, today, as we encounter these words from Jesus about what is to come, not just what is right now, we're invited to live with hands open, eyes open, hearts open to the dynamic presence of the living God who is moving in our midst, who promises us the worst thing is never the last thing, that when you feel like you're at rock bottom or at a dead end, God has other plans. Because a living God can still surprise us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.